Hello, welcome all to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins, Director. In case you are new to New Hampshire Peace Action educates, mobilizes, and organizes to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this bi-weekly conversation series as a way to continue our public education work over a year ago now. And we found it such an effective way to reach people and get our message out that our intention at this point is to continue it indefinitely. This conversation series is intended to help us engage and sort out how to make the changes that we've been trying to make to our world, our state, and our country. In that spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to take a moment before we get started to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We want to honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. So we're very excited tonight to have JerryAnne Boggis from the Black Heritage Trail down in Portsmouth to talk to us a little bit about her work. We wanted to make sure that we were keeping that in mind as we approach Juneteenth. And we're going to be hosted by Bill Maddox, our treasurer. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill to make introductions. Thank you for being with us, JerryAnne.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you very much, Will and Amy, and I'm glad to be here. Let me give you a little bit of intro to our program, and then I'll introduce JerryAnne. So Juneteenth is also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Liberation Day, and Emancipation Day. It's a holiday celebrating the emancipation of those who had been enslaved in the United States. So we want to ask some questions tonight about how does the lens of this unique Afro-American commemoration intersect with contemporary issues of Black Lives Matter and its opposition to police violence and the wider struggle for social and economic justice. JerryAnne has an encyclopedic grasp of history, rooted in what matters to activists and everyone who seeks a more just America. So she's going to highlight the series of Juneteenth-related events sponsored by the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, Found Lineage, celebrating African-American roots and branches, a focus on genealogical discovery, which has brought both extraordinary stories of reconciliation to the public, while the genetic data collected has demonstrated the stark brutality of America's history. JerryAnne is the executive director of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, the founder and director of the Harriet Wilson Project, and the previous director of diversity programs and community outreach at the University of New Hampshire. We're really excited to have you, JerryAnne. We have kind of a dual purpose here. One is to ask you some questions that I think a lot of us who are part of the Peace Action would be very interested in how the Black Heritage Trail navigated the extraordinary twin pandemics of both the coronavirus and also this terrible scourge of police violence that really were part of the hallmarks of 2020. So history-based organization dealing with contemporary issues in a time when you can't have public events must have been really challenging. So we want to talk a little bit about that and some questions related to that. And then we want to talk about Juneteenth because as I described, you have a lot of activities going on. It's very hands-on for people, real opportunity for people to get involved and learn about history and also genealogy and maybe their connection to different events. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to a conversation with everybody.
Yeah.
And I have to correct, I'm not a historian.
Well, you're becoming one.
Activist, yes. Historian. Yeah. I think historians would have a fit.
Okay. We won't tell anybody. we are going to make this interactive. We have a fairly small group of people, although it looks like it's growing, which is great. But yes, if you do have a question, then throw it into the chat and or raise your hand. If I see a hand up, I'll if we have a appropriate moment in the program, I'll ask you to ask your question. And otherwise, I'll leave it up to Will to navigate the chat. And but we'll just forge ahead here. And so the first thing I wanted to ask you, JerryAnne, and it relates to kind of my introduction, is, you know, we've seen this amazing and at times very difficult series of events unfold from the coronavirus pandemic and police violence pandemic, which of course didn't begin last year. So for an organization that focuses on the history of the Black community in New Hampshire, it must have been a real challenge to offer some level of regular planned programming virtually while dealing with the late-breaking events that seem to take place from month to month or day to day. So how did the Black History Trail manage this during 2020? For New Hampshire Peace Action, you know, using this Zoom format to hold events, as I think Will pointed out, has actually been very beneficial with many new people participating. So I know that you did have many online events, and did you see an increase in numbers and a wider range of folks coming to your events?
So 2020, as everybody can imagine, was definitely a watershed year, not only for organizations, but for the country in a whole, with the twin pandemic, as we say, of the coronavirus and racial tensions. And through racial tensions, as you said, were always there, but they came to a forefront in our country with the murder of George Floyd, where it became apparent to a lot of people that, yeah, America had a problem, and it had a racial problem. With everybody being quarantined and not being able to go out, we definitely had to think of different ways to keep our doors open, so to speak. And of course, the Zoom, lucky for all of us, especially nonprofits, the Zoom format was there. And so everybody had to learn a new way of being and communicating. And I kind of had to think about it in the ways of the enslaved people who found themselves on shores, maybe like New Hampshire, you know, total different weather, total different language, total different people. And they had to find ways to survive and had to be creative. They had to find different ways of communicating, of coming together to grasp an understanding, even though they may have been from different tribes. So that's kind of what we had to do, is see how we could deliver our programs in a way that would still attract people on a Zoom format. Lucky for us, our communities were interested in learning and discovering how we got to where we were. How did so many of us miss this degree of racialized tension? And what did that mean that we missed it? So people wanted to know. And because people wanted to know, we had an audience and we could do that. And we had a wide audience. We really did gain a lot of online people joining us. I think we went from our Tea Talks, one of our programs that we have, that are community-based dialogues where we get together, we pick a current issue and we talk about it. We have presenters and then the community dialogue around it. That was our format. So we were still able to bring people together in that way. We did lose the moment of the aha moments, is what I call them, when you're in a group with people and the surprise moments that conversations can bring up. We did lose that going to a Zoom format. We gained more people coming in, but I think at a time when the country needed to look at our history in an intellectual way and not so much an emotional way, the Zoom format was good and worked that way for us. So we just moved all our programs to online programming. We survived.
Yes.
For an organization with 1.5 people, but we have a lot of volunteers. We had to quickly think of ways to deliver meaningful programming that people wanted to hear. And that's what we did. Our tea talks, we usually had them at the library in Portsmouth, and we went from a total of maybe 700, 800 people for the season to a total of 5,000 people for the season.
Wow.
So what that told us is that people want to know. They want the information. And that movement, the Black Lives Matters movement, that brought together people from all backgrounds, all ethnicity, coming to look at the issue, really brought that to the forefront. How did we get to here we are, where we are? And this is where history becomes important for us to know, for us to understand. If we never look at our history truthfully, we can't understand where we are now. If we never look at our history truthfully, we can't plan for the future that we want or can imagine. It takes that retrospection, that looking back in an honest way, not just with rose-colored glasses, but in an honest, open way, and creating space to really live with that honesty in order to understand where we are and what we can do in the future.
That's great. Well, this might be a difficult question to answer unless you guys take kind of detailed metrics. But according to a lot of sources, the responses to the murder of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and so many others brought more people on the streets to protest than ever in the U.S. history, and was during a pandemic. There's been a massive increase in interest in racial justice issues and Black history over the past year. And I'm wondering if, you did the events of last year play an important role in terms of generating a large increase in people who normally might not have tuned in? I mean, what do you think? Is it was it a pandemic? We were all pent up, and we had little options for going out. What do you think do you have a sense of why people were showing up?
I think absolutely the George Floyd incident brought a lot of attention to the racial divide in the country. It's not the first time we've been here. The civil rights movement was very, of course, pivotal in getting some of the laws passed, but the country came together after seeing the dogs being let out on people in peaceful marches, right? We got to a point where we said, this is not right, or we opened our eyes to the mistreatment. And that's what happened with George Floyd again. We opened our eyes to this mistreatment of a human being and really looked at ourselves in the mirror to see what we were as a country, that we were not living up to the ideals that we profess. So America took a look at that, and it brought that movement to the Black Lives Matter movement. And again, that desire, how did we go from the civil rights movement? We thought we had fixed this back then, to being here with the same issues that we were dealing with back then, and trying to understand that. I think one of the mistrust in the Black community is understanding that we've seen these movements over and over again, where people, the majority gets involved, the the bar gets moved a little bit, and then we lose interest because we go back to that leveling, you know, and keeping that voice. So is this sustainable? That work of keeping it sustainable, I think, belongs to the majority now, to our white people, as I say, because we know, I don't think we can put that genie back in the bottle. We know we have a race problem, and there's no putting that back. So at some point, unless we want to keep putting a bandage over it and keep moving on, we just have to deal with the issue, deal with the systemic issues that create these divides, deal with the deeply held beliefs that create these divides, and really look at our history of enslavement and what that meant, and what it meant to a group of people who are on the outside, and how we come together to reconcile that history.
Thank you.
I know that's a whole bunch of different things in
Yeah,
your
no,
one
it is.
answer, but
Yeah, no, it's a complex set of things that are going on.
There's
So,
racism is a complex issue. I don't want to say it's too hard to understand, but it's a complex thing to break.
yeah. So here in New Hampshire, we've had our own troubles with the introduction of House Bill 544 and other actions by the New Hampshire legislature. I think we're looking at a backlash to the events of last year. Since so much of your work is about helping Americans, and especially people in New Hampshire, understand the hard truths of history, these complicated facts, how do you feel this effort to silence honest conversations will impact your work, even if these laws are not enacted? What do you see an impact for the Black Heritage Trail if you can't talk about quote unquote divisive topics? Could you be targeted?
We're targeted already without HB 544. So again, a political movement to not talk about a truthful history is afoot. What we do with that? How do we as Americans, what kind of country do we want to live in? It's a question we all have to ask ourselves, and what that means, in spite of or despite of a bill, HB 544. If we want the status quo, then our communities will do nothing. If we want to move towards a more socially just and equitable society, then we'll voice our objection. And I have to say that I'm speaking on this for myself and not as a representative of the Black Heritage Trail, because as a nonprofit, we can't, I can say that we're against the bill, but I can't go any further than that. But I'll talk for myself on the bill.
Right.
What is a divisive concept, and who does it divide, is the first thing I think about when I think about this bill. Is the truth divisive? Is the narrative that we've always told about America, where one group gets preferential treatment over another in the way we look at, believe, act, stereotype them? What is divisive about looking at a true history? It changes the power dynamics to look at a true history. And that to me is where the fear is with this language, where people are afraid of critical race theory, of really honestly looking at our country. It's a fear of giving up a certain perceived power. And in that's where change happens. I heard it's not only just power to, it's fear of what happens when an underrepresented group gets to speak and gets to openly look at our history. A fear of retribution. There was a pastor on that was talking the other day that really it's springing from the fear that African Americans will do what people profess them to be doing. And I'm only picking one section of the bill that I'm talking because it's, it's other underrepresented groups. But when we think of retaliation, that brings fear. If you're going, and retribution and all of those things bring a certain amount of fear to our general public. So if we keep the status quo, that's something that we know, and that's something we can manage. But we don't know what those unruly, underrepresented groups will do if we give them social justice or give them a seat at the table to talk. My goodness, they may treat us like we treated them, which is very fearful.
That sounds a lot like, the idea of, I don't know if you've heard this, I'm sure you have, replacement theory. The idea that people of color are going to replace white people. It's a kind of a main tenet of hardcore white supremacy. And my next question is,
Bill, I should say that has been a fear ever since we had enslavement, right? The whole issue of race came about because the wealthy class was afraid of the poor, both indentured white folks and Black folks coming together and throwing them out, right? So it's the mass coming together to overthrow the ruling class that created this whole notion of race. Let's divide this group and create so that they stay fighting against themselves and we can still stay ruling. And I mean, if you look through all of the history stuff, the amalgamation of the blood was something that everybody was afraid of, because God knows what would happen if we had mixed blood people, and not even to talk about Native Americans that we wanted to say that we completely wiped out, right? But this whole notion of race mixing, blood, amalgamation of the blood, mingling of blood, speaks to the declining of the ruling class. And so that division and all that, it's the same thing that we continue to do. I mean, that's what HB 544 does. It still continues to create that divide. We have a narrative that keeps the status quo, and any other narrative whereby other classes, other groups, women have a voice for themselves, Black folks have a voice for themselves that can tell the truth of their story, disrupts that norm.
Right. So as an organization whose mission is really about educating people on history, I'm curious as to what is your approach to dealing with these revisionists that try to censor important work like the 1619 Project and replace it with inaccurate and essentially racist accounts of U.S. history? What is your advice to educators and others who are confronted by these inaccuracies and misleading approaches, which are literally whitewashing the indisputable facts of our nation's founding? I mean, how do we deal with this?
So Bill, that's a good question. So, and I'm going to speak for myself, and I know this is live stream, and I know I'm going to get in trouble.
You're not speaking on behalf of the Black Heritage Trail. We make that clear.
Yeah, I'm going to speak for myself on this one. So, I think a lot of us, maybe I'll say Black folks, a lot of Black folks, when we looked at the results of the voting last year, we were surprised that the country was almost split in half on these notions, these issues around race. And that was like, before that, in my own way, what I thought that I believed in the principles of a third, right? A third of the people will be with you, no matter what you're doing. The second third may be interested in what you're doing. So they will want to find out, they'll read, they'll educate, they'll come to events that you have. And then a third of the people are not interested at all, right? And so my job, my individual work was to reach that second, the people who were interested, bring them to the interest, who were to the people who are with you. And you'd have 2/3 of the people with you in an idea. And then if you have the majority with you, then that person, that group that weren't interested would eventually become interested, and you could move that ball along, right? But in our environment now, I have to say that we just have to keep doing what we think is right. And what I think is right may not be what the next person thinks is right, right? But we do have that historical documents. We do have that history story. We do have other ways of looking and of being a human being, whether we believe history is right or not. There's a humanness to our lives, where lives matter, where the individual lives matter. And so if we do our work on the notion that life matters, individual lives matters, and do that to the best of our abilities by truth telling, then we have a chance. Our country has a chance. And it's at this point, the moving that dial for understanding racism, white people have to do their work. They just have to. Black people have to do the work of healing. We have to do the work of healing ourselves in our communities. And white people have to do the work of understanding what this race and racism means, and how the white community is going to heal itself. And then we can come together as a healed society. That's my own personal belief. So as far as the work that I do with the Black Heritage Trail, it is about raising awareness of these stories, of these individuals, people who did everything humanly possible to thrive and survive in a culture that said that they did not belong, that they were not worthy, that they were less than human, where our law says they were 3/5 human, right? So raising that awareness and having people to see that, yes, they loved, they laughed, they had children, we wanted homes, we wanted security, everything that every individual human wants were no different. Then I think by doing that and doing it in your own backyard, we have these stories in every little hamlet of New Hampshire, these stories in every little corner that we look. If my neighbor next door understands that two doors down in the 1800s, this man was making these horseshoes for that man over there, we have a different understanding and different view of the environment that we live in. So that's our role at the Black Heritage Trail, is to tell these stories. And I don't want to beg other people to understand the humanness of these people, but to understand the stories and the striving and the how they contributed to this fabric that is our state. I don't think we have to claim our humanness anymore. We are human, but this is what we did. And we left a mark, and we're remembered, and we deserve our place in this historical place.
That's great. Yeah, I think by people placing themselves in history and making that history real to them, like it's the place I live in, it's someone I know, it's a building I go to frequently, whatever, it helps to make it real. And then the humanity kind of creeps out to say, well, and these were people who were treated in a different way. The culture and the commerce and the laws and everything conspired against the kind of unity that we would have liked to have seen. And I think that's really, really key. And that's really essentially what Juneteenth is all about. We're really excited about the different activities that the Black Heritage Trail is planned. And before we open up to some questions and discussion, I wanted to see if you would kind of walk us through, I don't know if it'd be good to share the website or what would be the best way to do that, but it's really great for folks to hear what's being planned, because I just signed up for a workshop that's going to be talking about genealogy, and it's exciting that we have tools today that we didn't have 15 or 20 years ago. So why don't you go ahead and tell us what's going to be going on over the next week or so?
Sorry, my screen is busy, but I have the website up. This year, Juneteenth event is scheduled from June 17th through 19th. There are a lot of virtual and in-person events. We titled this event Found Lineage, Celebrating African-American Roots and Branches. And it really is looking at where science and history collides through the DNA, the rise in DNA testing, really trying to understand how that knowledge from the DNA testing is affecting our understanding of the landscape, the American landscape, what it means to the individual African-American to find out these connections to its roots, and what it means to our majority folks, our white folks who have done these genealogy research, who are doing African-American research, who are trying to learn about this history. How does all this knowledge change the landscape, not only the physical landscape, but the landscape of our own hearts? And so the first program scheduled for Thursday, June 17th is a workshop. It's Finding Our Roots, Researching Black History and Genealogy. One of the things that the Black Heritage Trail have found, we keep getting these questions all the time from historical societies, from different individuals. How do you do Black history? How do you research it? How do you know if enslaved people lived in your neighborhood? How do you know if African-American war veteran was buried here? So we brought together a group of scholars, experts, to really look at, to do this workshop. It's for a well-heeled historian, as well as for the novice who's starting out, how to do. So we've got Sean Halifax, who is from the African American Museum in DC, who will talk about how to do the research. We have two community members who will talk about what they've learned from doing their own research. One's an African-American male, who is Bob Bellinger, who did his own research all the way back to the African continent. And we have a descendant of the Moffat lads from Portsmouth, who is a white woman who started doing her own genealogy work and found out her family's involvement in the slave trade. So we'll have that dialogue as well. And then what it means the bigger genealogists will also talk about what that means. So I'm looking forward to this workshop. It's the next thing we have. Again, Juneteenth is a celebration for us. It's one of the times in the Black Heritage Trail, we mix the celebration, the entertainment with education in all the programs that we do, in getting information out. So we partnered with the music hall for this musical celebration. We have a Broadway singer, Nakenje, who is going to be honoring African-American sopranos. And one of them is our own Nellie Brown Mitchell, who in the 1800s was a very famous African-American soprano that lived in Dover, New Hampshire. So we'll highlight her story a bit and celebrate with music and a local band, which should be very, very fun. We have another panel discussion on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, where we're bringing together what we wanted to look at with this panel was how these stories through DNA, how they actually are changing the landscape. So this is the one where we're looking and having that discussion. We have a storyteller, interpreter, tour interpreter, Elon Cook, who will talk about, finding these stories and sharing them, how they're creating these bridges between Blacks and whites, understanding our history and where we are now through the lens of stories and finding out these new stories. And one of our presenters, Dr. Reginald Anderson, he's going to talk about the dangers of all these signs. Of course, where there's always two sides to a coin, no matter what the science is and how it's used. The power of that science, how we use it, is not inherently good or bad, but can be used either for good or bad. So we'll have that discussion on the other side of the DNA science explosion. Mm-hmm. And then we're closing out the celebration at the African Burying Ground with live drumming, chanting, and dancing. We have two, they're called, in the West African tradition, they're called Babaloas, and those are holy men from the tradition. So two renowned Babaloas will be performing, one will be chanting. In the West African tradition too, in a time when healing or discipline is needed, the communities will get together, and there's a society called the Egungun Society, which is an ancestral society. And they will come, like in this image, we have somebody all dressed, a totally masked person, which represents the spirit of the ancestors. And they will perform healing, discipline, talking within the community to really heal and mend the community. So that's what we're going to have at the African Burying Ground. We'll have an Egungun dancer, as well as chanting, and then the drummers, to close out the celebration as we honor the ancestors and the journey where we've been to where we are today. And hopefully perform a sense of healing within our community. So that's what our Juneteenth celebration is this year.
That's terrific. Well, Todd put the link in the chat so people can find out more about exactly what's going on, but it sounds like a really wonderful weekend. I'll be participating in some or all of it. I did see a hand up from John. John, would you like to ask a question? And that will kind of kick off our interactive part of the evening. So go ahead, John. If you want to unmute or type it in the chat, either way. John, we can't hear you. All right, well, we're waiting for John. we have a question from Linda Kennison. What can we do in the face of so many states passing voter suppression laws, including New Hampshire? Is that something you feel like is within your wheelhouse, JerryAnne?
I think sometimes we as individuals, and I feel that way too, we have a sense of helplessness because of the way our voting, our democracy is structured. But then we forget the voice and the power of that voice when we come together. It's that power coming together that creates change. And we just have to organize around that. There are groups everywhere that are working against these voter suppression laws. But it's so easy to become apathetic in our society, because we're so divided from that real power. Our legislators, our Congress people, we're so, we give our power over to them and say, go and do this on our behalf. And we give that power over easily, expecting them to really be legislating on our behalf. And we get disappointed when they don't. And then we go, okay, we'll change it next year by getting somebody else. And we forget the power that we still hold within ourselves to really, it's a democracy. We say we're a democracy. We need to act like we're a democracy. I don't know what else to say on that. It's no longer okay to sit on the sidelines and give up what's been hard fought for and hard won. I mean, people died for us to have the right to vote. And we don't have that luxury to sit back and give it up. That's what a democracy is. It's the voice of the people.
Yep, I think that's really important. And we did see, to the credit of many people here in New Hampshire, hundreds of people, because of the new kind of Zoom format that the legislature used, hundreds of people came out to testify on various bills. It didn't seem to have much sway with the legislators, unfortunately, but it was really amazing to see, 300 or 400 people and having the ability for, people's actual testimony to go out to the entire New Hampshire community. It was really, really excellent. So John, I want to see if your mic is now working and you'd like to ask a question. All right. Well, we're waiting for John. Other questions for JerryAnne, other comments people like to make. And it's really wonderful answers to some complex questions here. It'll be interesting to hear what people are thinking about the things that you've heard so far. While we're waiting, what I'm going to do is, just so I don't forget this at the end, is because it's apropos to what we just talked about. There is going to be a demonstration on Saturday at the State House, Courage Over Censorship, a march and meditation on the consequences of HB 544. Peace Action is a co-sponsor along with a number of other organizations. So it'll be at the State House from 4 to 5:30 on Saturday, and we hope you can make it. It's really an opportunity to give your voice, if you haven't already, or even if you have already, to oppose this legislation in the final hours where the legislature, through the Committee of Conference, is finalizing, which will be a very unworkable and basically racist, sexist law. So please come out and look at the, I'll put a link to the Facebook page in the chat in a minute. Will has a question for you, JerryAnne. Can you talk a little bit about when and how the Black Heritage Trail began and how you got started in this work?
Okay. So the Black Heritage Trail is an outgrowth of the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail, which was started over 25 years ago by Valerie Cunningham in Portsmouth, if any of you know her. And I think that story is really an important one in showing the power of one. Here we had Valerie Cunningham, African-American woman born and raised in Portsmouth, who really, her search started with finding herself in her own town, right? Looking at herself as a young Black child and wanting to know if there were any other people like her in her neighborhood and what that history was. So that started her on a historical journey of finding herself in her community. And in so doing, she found the Black history of Portsmouth, which ended up in a book, Portsmouth Black History. And in so doing, from that one search started when, as a young child, led to finding all these other stories across the state. So I was part of the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail about 7 years ago, and we were looking at all these histories. We were doing everything just in Portsmouth, and we had all these other stories that other researchers were doing. Eric over in Hancock, the people over in Warner, Andover, all over doing this research. And we said 4 years ago, a group of founding members for the Black Heritage Trail looked at this and said, we need to spread this beyond just Portsmouth. And that's what started the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail. Because this history might have started in the seacoast, but it's, again, what I've said, it's all over our state. And I think knowing that this history is all over our state really changes our image of what New Hampshire is. New Hampshire is always talked about as one of the whitest states in the Union. But when we start looking at the history back from the 1600s, there's story everywhere in the North Country where you would not expect, to have a story of a Black person. In Andover, the most famous magician, African-American, Richard Potter lived there. Coit Mountain, named after Vance Coit. Just everywhere you look, there's these stories, and it's just fascinating to come up and find them. And for my own personal story, it was finding that story of Harriet Wilson in Milford, in the town that I've lived in for over 35 years now. Finding that story of the woman who was the first Black woman to publish a novel in English, that she was born and raised in a town that I now call home, that I never knew anything about. There's not a street sign that honors the accomplishment of this woman. And I looked at that and said, if it had been a white woman, there would have been a sign that said, home of Harriet Wilson, the first white woman to publish a novel in the world. There's no sign. This high school doesn't even study the book that she wrote. So that got me into raising awareness for this woman. It led to me forming a group, the Harriet Wilson Project, which led to us building a monument in Wilson's honor, which became the first monument in the state that honored a Black person. And it was just, at every turn, my mind was just blown at these stories, this willful forgetting of people in a society that contributed so much to the fabric of not only our country, but, the state in which I lived. The story of Ona Judd, you know, connected us to Washington, you know, the founding fathers, you know, even though we didn't need to be found, but that's in quotes. But more than that, that those stories create a sense of belonging in a place, right? Knowing that history, knowing that Black people lived, worked, sweated, everything right on this very place. The same thing for Native Americans. On this land where my feet are is a line that connects me beyond this place, created a sense of belonging and investment in a town. If you want people invested in your town, let them know that they belong. And so
And if
that's
you-
how I got involved in it, Will.
That's great. And you can actually go on a tour, a Black History Trail tour of Milford, which I did yesterday for the first time, with a great tour guide named Dave Nelson, who it ends up at the Harriet Wilson statue and monument. And so you can contact the Black Heritage Trail for information about that, but it's well worth coming to Milford for that and learning a lot about the early history of this area that you might not find anywhere else. So, JerryAnne, Lois Cody has asked, can you describe your relationship with schools and whether there's a chance of expanding to other parts of New Hampshire, which I think actually the Black Heritage Trail is working on?
Yeah, we're definitely working to expand statewide. This year in the fall, we've done programs across the state. This year in the fall, we'll put up 4 markers in 4 different towns as a sign of our expansion beyond the seacoast. We're working on one in Hancock, Warner, Milford, Exeter, and maybe Andover by the end of the year. And those places, those 5 places, we've done tours, led tours in those 5 towns. The way the Black Heritage Trail is expanding statewide is through, we've divided the state in its 7 tourist areas. And in all those areas, we're created relationships with the historical societies in a school, if there's one there, where and we're looking at fully documented histories in the towns where we are. We've got 14 towns where we're ready to expand to. All it takes is manpower and money to do what we're doing. But that's how we're expanding. You know, we have tea talks in different areas other than Portsmouth. We have tours in places other than Portsmouth and other events. One of the things with Zoom has allowed us to really connect across the state a lot faster than we would have without the Zoom format. But I forgot the rest of the question in talking.
Well, the question was about schools. Are you able
schools?
To,
so
yeah.
In schools are a whole different ball game. Schools, we work in some schools as going in and telling the stories, and we work with schools in creating tours. We're designing curriculum on using the local history that we have. We did one on Portsmouth Black history. Right now we're working on building a curriculum around the film Shadows Fall North. And that's one way we get in the schools, but schools are run by school boards, which are quite interesting to get in. So we're looking at after school programs. Maybe one of the other things we talked about, summer camps, and going it to the small, in a smaller way. We have a cohort of teachers who we're working with through this curriculum. Schools are problematic. it's the root where the change needs to happen, but it's such a systemic issue that it needs to happen on so many fronts. Our universities have to teach our teachers how to teach this history so that our teachers are more comfortable going in front of a classroom and teaching a book like Our Nig or Sketches in the Life of a Free Black, and not be afraid of the word Our Nig. So we need to teach our teachers. They don't know what they don't know. And so that's one of the things that has to happen. We have to educate our communities so that there's not this fear around critical race theory, that, we're teaching a corrective narrative of our history. And so many places, our historical sites have to tell a more inclusive story. So when it comes to being in school, there's so many different places where we need to augment that education. So for us, we go into schools, yes. We'll go into a particular teacher who invites us. We're building curricula. We're creating these little cohorts of teachers who want to learn, who are doing their own creative stuff in their classrooms, bringing them together and working that way. School boards and legislations is a whole other ballgame. I hope that answered that question. I think it was interesting. Somebody asked what else we can do, around the whole political, there's so many fronts that we can work on: educating ourselves, educating our community, bombarding our legislators for change. I think one of the things that we found to be effective at the trail is these community dialogues, where you create a safe environment for people to talk about contested histories or social issues. Nothing beats a group of people coming together and dialoguing around an issue to create understanding. Because once you understand, you can't push that back. It's moving forward. I don't know.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. In the interest of finishing close to the end, I want to wrap up, and I'm going to turn this over to Will in a second. But JerryAnne, this has been really fantastic. We could have talked for another hour. I really appreciate your insights. Despite the fact that you're not a historian, you're a teacher of history. And the work that the Black Heritage Trail does is so essential for New Hampshire to understand a lot of the nuances and details and really important facts that just otherwise we wouldn't know if your organization wasn't out there doing this work. And I hope that inroads to schools are going to happen, and we all need to do whatever we can to make sure that this tremendous resource gets shared with the kids in our schools so they have a better understanding of what's going on in our state and where we came from, what our history is, all of it, not just some whitewashed sanitized version. So thank you so much, JerryAnne. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate it too. Thank you. Thanks, Joel.
And I'll turn this over to Will.
Well, I want to also say thank you, JerryAnne, so much for your work, and thank you for being with us tonight and sharing some of your work with us. And thank you, Bill, for hosting tonight. If you'd like to stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action, you can check us out at nhpeaceaction.org. Make sure you get on our email list. These conversations happen every other Monday. So we are currently booked out through October. The series will remain free and open to everyone. However, if you're able to make a contribution at any time, feel free to go to nhpeaceaction.org/donate. For the next few conversations, June 21st will be Sandra Yarney and Will Thomas, who will talk about their work at the Palestine Education Network. We'll be skipping July 5th for the 4th of July, but coming back in on July 19th with Becky Field, who's going to tell us stories of immigrants in New Hampshire. After that, August 2nd, John Lamperti. It's going to be stories from a lifetime of peace activism. And we go on. We're currently booking out into November. So stay with us every other week. And thanks for joining us tonight. Good night.